I want to give you a quick introduction to Maus, which is, by some people's accounts, one of the most powerful books of the 20th century, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of our study. It is a beautiful but difficult book, and I want to point out a few things here as you start reading it so that you can get the most out of your first reading. Several students have told me over the years that they read it 2 and 3 times just because they know they miss things. I certainly don't expect that. That's why I want to give you some heads up of things that you might not otherwise notice until your second or third reading of it. First thing is that this is a story of, is 2 stories in one. The frame story is the story of the relationship between an elderly father, Vladek, and his son, Art. And the pretense for the story is that Art is interviewing his father about Vladek's experiences during the Holocaust, during World War II, when he serves as a soldier and then gets moved to a Jewish ghetto in Poland and ultimately sent to Auschwitz. So one of the things that you're going to pay attention to is how Spiegelman moves from the father-son story to the story of the father in the Holocaust. And he uses, rather than saying, okay, now this is my dad narrating his story, he uses very simple tools available to graphic novelists to set off the transition. The primary tool that he uses is that in the current story of the father and the son, the dad that he's interviewing in, quote, real time, he doesn't include borders on those panels. He does include borders, as you see here on the left, when the father is narrating his experiences in the past. So while that's the primary tool, pay attention to when there are other places in the story when he transitions from the old man Vladek to the Vladek who is narrating his story of the Holocaust. Pay attention to how he does those transitions. In most cases, they're seamless. But if he doesn't use this transition from a bordered to a borderless panel, ask yourself, why does he change his technique here? What does that mean? The book begins with a prologue, 2 pages, and as you start to read, ask yourself, what do you notice right away? First off, like Persepolis, this story is in black and white. Go ahead and thumb through the rest of the book and see if you notice any color. Okay. Now, as you were thumbing through the book, also, did you notice a difference in style between Persepolis, which is the other black and white story that we've read, and Spiegelman's images? I think most of us would say that Spiegelman's images are far more complex than Satrapi's images are drawn. And so as you are reading, what effect does that lack of color and complexity have on your understanding of an appreciation for the story? Next thing you're going to notice is, yep, this is a story with mice. Every character in this book is an animal. Now I'm going to go ahead and tell you that Spiegelman draws every Jew as a mouse. And I want you to think about why he would draw the Jews as mice in a story about the Holocaust. Every other racial, cultural identity has its own animal. The Poles, the Jews here are the mice, the Germans, the French make a very small appearance, and the Americans make an appearance at the end as well. I'm going to ask you eventually which animal Spiegelman chooses for each of those groups of people, and what do you think he is saying about his choice of animal? Think then also about what MacLeod says. Remember, he's talked about the idea that if an image is iconic, in fact, if it is less specific, we tend to see ourselves in that character, where we can identify more with that character. So what is Spiegelman's choice of real people being mice and pigs and other animals have to do? Does that create empathy for us, or does that create distance between us and the story? Finally, here in the prologue, this is an introduction to the 2 main characters, Vladek and Art. So what do we learn about them on this 2 pages? Spiegelman makes a choice to set these 2 pages off separate from the main book, and you'll notice up in the left-hand corner, he notes that these 2 pages happen in 1958. It's the only 2 pages in the entire book that take place when Art is a child. The rest of the book is him as an adult. So what do we learn on these 2 pages about these 2 characters that sets us up for the rest of the story? Spiegelman, far more than any of the other, well, probably far more certainly than Satrapi and Hergé do, plays with the arrangement of panels, borders of panels, shapes and sizes of panels, and the style of images. And so this is just one page here that I pulled out. Practically no 2 pages in the book are alike. So what effect does this have on the story? In the one that I pulled out here, what I happen to notice is that the center of the page is a larger borderless panel, but there are smaller bordered panels set in this borderless panel, but that even the background bleeds behind these bordered panels. Why would he do that? What effect does it have on the story? Notice at the bottom of this page there's 2 very small thin panels. Again, on every page, see if you can pick out, why does he do it this way? Why are there long thin panels? Why fat panels? Why borderless panels? Just take note of it. Something else that I noticed as I was reading it is that he, in some cases, includes, for example, a drawn image of a photograph. And notice that this panel is set at an angle, and it overlaps a bordered and a borderless panel. Again, why would he do that? In this case, he's using it to transition from the story. And even I always wonder about, how does our eye know how to read those 3 panels? How do we know to read that very top panel of him on the exercise bike, and then look at the caption above the picture, and then go to that bordered panel which is beneath the picture? How does our eye know to go from one panel to the next? Think back to what MacLeod said, but then also, why does he do this? Why does Spiegelman use this technique both here and in other places in the book? There's one place in the book where he uses an actual photograph, and I want you to really, and it's actually in the second half of the book that you're not reading for the first week, but pay attention to that. But in other places he uses drawn images of photographs, and again, what effect does that have? Here at the page of 84, page 82, depending on what version you have, I want to draw your attention to that panel at the top where he says, where Vladek is riding his bike and Artie is recording him as he's been doing throughout the book. And the father says, when we were in the ghetto in 1943, Tosha took all the children too. Artie interrupts him, wait, please, Dad, if you don't keep your story chronological, I'll never get it straight. Tell me more about 1941 and 1942. So, okay, I'll make it how you want it. 1941? And then he goes on with his story. The question that this prompts in me is, how do we create, how do we understand, and how do we tell the stories of our lives? We live through events, but we tell the story of them in different ways at different times. If I go through something awesome or something difficult, and I tell the story of it right after it happened, I tell one story. But if you ask me about that event a year later or 10 years later, I might understand that particular event differently. So my question on a larger scale for you is this: is Maus a true story? How do we rely on what Vladek tells us and what art records? What is true? At the end of the day, is Maus a work of fiction or nonfiction? In the book, you're also going to notice that Spiegelman includes a couple sections or images that aren't really part of the main story. In particular, on page, I think it's 100, 101, depending on your version of the book, he includes a comic called Prisoner on Hell Planet, A Case History. It's a comic that he had drawn much earlier in his career. You're going to notice that the style of it looks very different. What do we learn? Why would he include this at this point in the story? But in other places he includes some unusual diagrams and maps and other things. So why does he include this information that is very different from the main story? What does that do? What effect does that have on the overall story? Page 159, 158, it's the only page in the entire book, and I could be wrong, but I went back through and I tried to double check this. It's the only page that has an image drawn right to the edge of the page. Every single other page, there's a white border. So why here? Why does this image go all the way to the bottom of the page? How does that pictorial choice add impact to the story in a way that words can't? Finally, there are several terms throughout the book that you're going to encounter, and while I always expect that you are looking up terms you don't encounter, and there may be others that I missed, a couple things I want you to know. When Spiegelman and most others use the word Jew to define themselves or others, the word Jew has multiple meanings. People identify as Jewish because they are religiously Jewish. People may be racially Jewish, or people are people whose descendants came from Israel or currently live in Israel. For some people, those terms overlap and people are all of those things, but in some cases, people are Jewish only because their parents were Jewish, but maybe they don't practice the Jewish religion. There are people who are only religiously Jewish and have completely different racial or national identities. The Judenrat is the Jewish councils that were used to govern in the ghettos, in the Jewish ghettos, and the Nazis picked people to be on the Judenrat, and then those folks were expected to ensure that all Nazi orders and regulations were implemented. Pages 60, 61, is the only mention of religion within the entire book. And because it is exceptional, that's where I want you to pay attention to its meaning. It's an incident in which Vladek is talking to a rabbi, and he talks about Parshas Truma. And it's a section in Exodus that is read out of the Torah in synagogue, in which God gives his instructions for creating the tabernacle and its furnishings. That's what that means, is an entire separate section of scripture. So think back to your scripture and what creating the tabernacle, if you studied that in scripture, what that means. But at the very least, it has to do with creating a place for the Jews to consider their home. But again, it's because it's the only mention of religion in the book that it stands out and thus is important. Finally, the last term for you to be aware of is the term capo. The Nazis would often select a Jewish person to carry out their orders within the camp. Unfortunately, the capos saw that they needed to be as brutal as the German SS force was to their fellow Jewish prisoners in order to save their own lives and perhaps to get better rations, better place to sleep, and literally sometimes just to stay alive. We're faced with very difficult choices. Do I carry out this punishment or do I myself get killed? Interestingly enough, it became one of the sticking points of who was prosecuted after the war. Were the capos themselves guilty of war crimes like the Germans? Again, that's a whole other ethical dilemma, but just so you have a sense of how brutal someone can be when his life is on the line, that's what the capos were. Hope all this helps, and enjoy your reading.